Welcome to Leadership Explored, the podcast where we explore what it means to lead in today's world. I'm Ed Schaefer, joined as always by my co-host Andy Siegmund. Today we're exploring a loaded and often misunderstood idea in tech and business, the mythical 10x contributor. You've probably heard it before, phrases like I'm a 10x engineer, they're a 10x leader, or someone saying they only hire 10x people. But what does that actually mean? And why do we keep chasing it? Is it someone who delivers 10 times the work, 10 times the results, or just 10 times the noise? In this episode, we're unpacking the 10x concept, where it comes from, why it persists, and what it reveals about how we think about talent, performance, and leadership. We'll talk about the difference between outputs and outcomes, the value someone creates for the team, and how the 10x mindset can look very different depending on the stage of your career. So Andy, have you ever heard someone refer to themselves or someone else as 10x, or have you heard someone say they only want to hire 10x people?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is super common in the tech space. And another way that I've heard it talked about a lot is like, I only hire A players, right? It's always some proxy for we only want the best of the best. And I think it's well intentioned, generally speaking, but I think it's just not founded in truth and reality, or oftentimes not founded in need for an organization overall. Right, I think that if you only hire the best of the best, you usually don't have the right team and support. And I think if you create a viper's nest of super careerist, super ambitious folks without anyone who just wants to sit down and do the work, your organization is also usually going to have a whole ton of trouble. Ed, I think you've got a pretty funny story about somebody else self-identifying for this, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, the idea for this episode actually came from a real interview that I did a number of years ago. I was talking to an engineering candidate who, on paper, I'll admit, they seemed great. They had a really strong background and lots of confidence, and they checked all the boxes that you might expect. But I asked one of my go-to interview questions, which is, what do you bring to a team that no one else does? And this guy says, with total confidence, I'm a 10x developer. That means I do 10 times the work and I'm 10 times faster than anyone else on the team. And I heard that and it just made me pause. And I kind of almost laughed. I've heard people joke about 10x developers before, and I've seen memes, but I'd never heard anyone say that about themselves, especially not in a real serious job interview. And for me, it didn't come across as confident. I'm sure that's what he was going for, but for me, it came across as cocky. And I think more importantly, I thought it was revealing about him, because his answer wasn't anything about how he makes a team better. It was all about what he does individually. And in my head, I was thinking, do you also deliver 10 times the bugs and 10 times the technical debt? But more than that, all I could think was, well, if your whole value is I do 10 times more than other people on the team, and none of it's about elevating the team or making the people around you better, is that really even 10x, or is it just noise and busyness? So that interview really stuck with me, and it just struck me, and it got me thinking, what do we really mean when we say someone is 10x? And that's what made me want to explore the idea more deeply, and what led to this episode. So I did a little research to see, where does this idea of 10x or 10x contributor even come from, and why does it resonate so much in tech and leadership circles? And as far as I could find, the term 10x developer, it seems to trace back to some studies, or at least one study from the 60s and 70s. There was research that claimed the best software engineers were 10 times more productive than the worst. The methods and findings of these studies are pretty debatable and questionable, but the idea stuck for some reason. And over time, it evolved, first in engineering culture, then in hiring and VC spaces. And it became this like shorthand for an elite performer, or the A players, like you said. And like a lot of things in tech and business, it kind of became a buzzword over time and a myth. It seems like it's something that you'd see in resumes, job descriptions, and Twitter bios. But it also started to shift meaning, I think. It wasn't about productivity anymore. It became this kind of shorthand and mindset for someone who's supposedly faster, smarter, and better, and someone who doesn't just contribute but dominates. So I know, Andy, you've been around a lot of engineering teams and hiring conversations. What do you think about the origin of this idea and how people use it now? And do you think it's a buzzword at this point, or do you think it still means something?
I think the way we use it is probably a buzzword, Ed, right? Like it's a proxy, um, but I think it's a poor one at that, right? Because take this individual you're talking about in the interview, right? Doing 10x the work is not it's not that impressive, generally speaking, right? And it also totally lacks context, right? So I think you're like, if we want to use it as a heuristic or as a thought exercise, I think thinking about 10x people is useful, but the 10x aspect of it, when we look at it super myopically, of like I write 10 times the I do 10x the work, 10x as fast, etc. Like it's a really, really narrow field. If I can get you for 1x the price, like, okay, yeah, that's probably cool. But there's also probably a whole bunch of other baggage that you have to deal with for that sort of personality type. But if you're truly 10x, if we look at it, right, if we think about like compounding interest or scale, it's about blast radius, right? And how do we actually grow our teams or impact our teams so that we all create 10x the work, right? Or 10x the outcomes that we're looking at overall, right? And that I think is where we sort of go off. And and also like that self-identification, whether it's somebody individually saying I'm a 10x engineer, or organization saying we only hire A players, or 10xers, I think is this like false cry that like we all want to be elite at something. But if you think about it, right, if you're a sports fan and you listen to any like sports punditry or whatever, you realize that like elite needs to be a very small subset, right? Like truly elite performers, right? Like there are 3 to 5 elite players at any given position in any given professional sport. And the blend of the team is figuring out where do you need elite talent, where can you be league average, and where can you be league below average, and remind yourself that these are the top 1% of the performers that we're talking about as well. And I think that our business needs to also understand that, right? Where do you want to put your money? Where do you want to put your effort? Where do you truly need elite performance? Like you might need, you know Richard and Dinesh and Guilfoyle, the 10x developers in your startup, but in your legacy banking application, you probably don't need those 10x developers. You probably need much more team cohesion and much lower risk taking in order to achieve your business outcomes.
Yeah. Well, I think you touched on some of why this idea sticks so much. I think the appeal around it is just how simple the promise is, right? Like you said, oh, we just hire one person, but we get the output of 10 people. Of course, everybody would want that if it was possible to get it. I think it's also, or it can be, and sometimes it is aspirational. It does tap into this idea of being exceptional, and I want to be the person who transforms a team, and we all do, I think, most of the time, and that can feel pretty powerful. And like you said, in fast-moving and competitive industries, the idea of a 10x contributor does promise an edge or a shortcut or an advantage. And I think
Or
the
or it might be a necessity depending on your cash runway, your market, right? Like
yeah,
it could be critical.
that's possible too. Yeah, and I think when you look at those areas, the language that gets used around this concept, I think it ties in, or it boosts this mythology about the 10x developers. We hear, 10x developers are rock stars, unicorns, ninjas, game changers, and those are all kind of hero narrative type of language. But underneath all of it, like you were saying, and I was bringing up behind it, we're not talking about the teams anymore. We're just talking about outliers, and we're looking for individual magic instead of how can we make the collective better? How can we strengthen the team or raise the tide for all of the boats? And I think this ties back to our episode where we talked about leadership language, just about how the words that we choose and the ones we use, they shape what we prioritize. And so if we use language that makes us idolize the lone genius, we're probably re-emphasizing that, and we're forgetting about the systems and support that actually make performance possible. So, I mean, what do you think? Why do you think we're drawn to this kind of myth? And what do you think causes us to be or seemingly so obsessed with finding these mythical high performers or chasing 10x people instead of building high performance environments or high performance teams?
Yeah, I think it's like I think it comes down to us always just wanting to identify or self-identify as being elite or being among the best, right? We in sales-driven cultures, right? We won the deal, right? This is a winning company, right? I think that's all kind of the language that we use. So, we only hire the best, or we only hire A players, or we're looking for 10x players is, I think, a shorthand for that. And where I think we go wrong, and where I think we need to think about it is like building those high performing environments, right? So setting the conditions for success, and also trying to understand in every organization, you need above average performers and average performers, right? Generally speaking. And I don't mean to denigrate average performers. Average performers are by definition performant, right? But if we're only trying to look for the top of the top, we're either going to create a lot of conflict, a lot of personality sorts of issues, because we're fighting for ideas, we're fighting for limited oxygen, or we're going to have an organization where we're going to have a lot of attrition. You have to kind of stratify across the bell curve, and that should be designed right. I had a manager once who talked about how he kind of sees two different types of people who join any organization, and he called them careerists and jobbers. And right, the careerist is looking to promote, looking to grow, looking to do interesting things, and the jobber is looking to collect a paycheck and do what they're asked, and then go home at 5 o'clock. And they're both super valuable and super useful. You just have to identify them and deploy them appropriately. And I think when we talk about like the type A players and the 10x player, what we're trying to do is we're trying to work around having to effectively manage and deploy our organization and the talent within our organization, right? We're trying to avoid having to do bench management, right? Because, if every player on your team is the best player in the league, well, clearly we will win all of the games, but like it still doesn't, when battle tested, that principle falls apart 100% of the time. You still need to manage the bench. You still need to create chemistry. You still need to set the conditions for success.
Yeah. When I think I'm not always big on the sports analogies for myself personally, but I do think it's easier, or at least it seems like it'll be easier to bring in the best players than it would be to like take the Mighty Ducks and turn them into the best team by the end of the movie. And I think that's the same thing for business a lot of the times. I don't think it's easy to find and hire those mythical high performers to begin with, but I think a lot of people think, oh, it's going to be easier for us to hire someone that will be expert or whatever and can solve our problems, as opposed to building that knowledge and culture and team and everything to solve those problems down the road. And as appealing as this 10x idea is, it's actually really harmful in a lot of cases, because when we start looking for those mythical heroes instead of building healthy systems, it can lead to burnout, ego-driven culture, and a lot of blind spots. So let's talk about where the 10x mindset goes wrong and what we miss when we chase that label instead of the impact. There's a few things that I found that I wanted to call out. First, the research behind this concept is shaky at best. The original 10x stat, it came from a 1960s study that compared the best and worst programmers. And it wasn't average versus elite. It was literally best and worst. And even then, the performance gap, when they dug into it more, they found it had more to do with the environment rather than the raw skill. And there have been more recent studies that find that the real difference between a strong performer or contributor and an average one, or I mean, there's a reason bell curves exist. Most things are falling in the middle in a standard
Mhm.
distribution. So when you look at the difference between the strong contributors and average contributors, it's closer to only 2.5 or 3x, nowhere close to 10x. But that nuance, nobody picked up that research or that information and allowed this myth to just keep going. Uh, Second, I think the mindset that this idea of 10x creates is corrosive. When we have 10x as the ideal, people start chasing hero status instead of collaborating. It feels risky to be vulnerable. People tend to hoard information or avoid asking questions. And underlying it all, it seems like there's competition to be seen as the smartest in the room. And that kind of culture doesn't just erode trust, it creates elitism. If someone is labeled as 10x, what does that make everyone else? 1x, or just not as good, not as valuable. And we know from Google's Project Aristotle and other research on psychological safety that what actually drives team performance is psychological safety and not brilliance. And I think the 10x culture undermines that. And then a third thing that I was thinking about with this is the emotional toll is real, and it's a lot of times it's invisible because there's a lot of pressure, and it's pressure to either be or just be to look to have the perception of being a 10x person, and that can lead to burnout, anxiety, and most definitely imposter syndrome. There was a 2024 study that found stressed developers produce 50% more bugs and they solve problems 30% slower. So when we think about the kind of pressure that might be coming from this 10x culture and environment, it doesn't just hurt the people, it'll ultimately cause the results and the performance to tank as well. And in those cultures, even high performers can feel like they're failing, and it's not because their work's bad, but because the culture treats anything that's not perfect or mythical or idealized as not enough. And then you're feeling downtrodden, even when you worked hard and did a great job, because it wasn't the perfect job or the perfect work. Um,
Yeah, and there are organizations who manage that way, but the only way that that's sustainable is if you're a marquee enough name that your recruiting pipeline is functionally infinite.
yeah, and that you're just turning over people when they burn out and bringing fresh in until you burn them out. Yeah, definitely. And one final point I wanted to bring up on this as a where I think this really goes wrong, and that this in some ways might be one of the biggest ones, is this mindset of 10x, hiring 10x people. It creates big blind spots for leadership. And I've seen this a bunch of times where something goes wrong or you don't have a capability, and the leaders say, oh, we need better people, because that's easier than asking, oh, do we have the right systems in place, or what do we need to change? And then that can turn into leaders blaming individuals for slow output instead of fixing unclear priorities or bad tooling or unrealistic deadlines. I've seen teams that spent months chasing a 10x hire when what they actually needed was just something simple like better documentation or communication or a clearer roadmap. And sometimes you will see things happen where you get a short-term output spike, where you try to push on things, and but then what happens ultimately is there's burnout, attrition, or failure. A name for this is the 10x manager trap. So you might have seen this. A new manager comes in, they push really, really hard. They might get some quick wins or see some short-term performance boosts, but then the team collapses because they are getting burned out, or they don't like the manager and they don't want to work there, or it's too much competition and they just don't like the vibe anymore. And the data that I could find on this does back that up too, that toxic cultures have a 50% higher turnover rate. So I know I put a lot out there, Andy, but what do you think about all this? When you see or hear the 10x narrative, what comes to mind for you as far as the potential risks or downsides?
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered a lot of it, Ed. And you were saying, oh, looking for the right talent. And I think that there is always a talent aspect to this, right? And I firmly believe that if you have been in a role for 3 years or 5 years and you're hiring a peer for that role, right? So let's say, at Ed, you are on the hiring committee for somebody in the role that you've been on the last 3 years. The talent bar should always be consistently rising in any organization. So like you can do the job now, right? You are the bar. Like let's just assume that you are the median in your group. But Ed 3 years ago should no longer be able to get that job today if you're effectively managing your talent overall, right? Because we all should be getting better. We should be doing better over time. And I think like when we think about these kind of 10x things, what we're often missing is the actual outcome aspect of it, right? And I talked about this a little bit earlier. It's I think what we get hung up in is the idea that somebody does 10 times the work or is 10 times faster or whatever that heuristic is, because it's easy to track and it's easy to measure, right? You interview somebody and they're whip smart and they like, are fun to talk to and charming or whatever, right? You're like, oh, this is the person. But what I'm much more interested in is like, it's not can you write the code, right? Or any of that. It's what are the outcomes that you can actually deliver? And can you do them in a collaborative way? Can you lead through the team? So like I'm in the process of interviewing right now, and I've got people who are coming to me and saying, oh, I worked for XYZ company, and these are all the labels that I've worked at, and this is the size of the contract that I managed. And I asked them, great, so what was the outcome? And they can't answer that question, right? And I like that's kind of my bigger gripe with the 10x thing is I think it's focused on the easiest question to answer, right? Which is velocity, not business outcome, functionally speaking. And I think that we see that across engineering cultures. We see that in a lot of cultures, that we're focused on outputs, not on outcomes. And that I think is where we all kind of go wrong.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of I see that a lot where people get focused on like lines of code or hours or number of commits or whatever, and they forget to ask, is any of it actually making a difference? And I know when we were preparing for this, you told me a story from LinkedIn that I think really captured this idea of outputs and outcomes. You want to share that one real quick?
Yeah, and this I'm going to preface this with like I'm 99% sure that this is a made up story, like that was designed for maximum impact. But functionally, it's talking about like an engineer who's quiet in all of the meetings, doesn't really speak up, right? Kind of works to themselves, doesn't get super involved in everything, right? Hits all their normal stuff, shows up on time, but just seems to be either appearing disinterested or mostly like in read only mode, in all of the interactions. And then a major outage happens, and as everyone else is freaking out and talking and like trying to figure out what the heck is going on, this engineer is sitting quietly at their desk looking at like Grafana reports, and 5 minutes later figures out what the issue is and fixes it. And when asked, like, how'd you do that? He goes, well, in all the meetings, like I've just been listening and trying to understand the organization and what's going on. Why didn't you speak up? He responds like, well, it seemed like y'all had a lot more to say than I did, right? Just kind of the flippant thing. The moral of the story is that like it's a matter of outcomes that really determine somebody's worth to an organization, not visibility, not outputs, not like how loudly you can talk or how much you chime in on the meeting. It's whether or not you hit or exceed your KPIs, or like when the stuff hits the fan, do you actually go and solve the real problems, right? So can you perform at or above expectations when the proverbial game is on the line, or are you just really good in the interviews, right?
Yeah, and I think that story does it kind of flips things when we think about 10x, because that engineer, assuming they were a real person and a real story and everything, they weren't chasing output. He was delivering impact. So he solved the right
Mhm.
problem at the right time when it was needed, and it ultimately had a positive effect. And it wasn't about how many times he'd done the thing; it was about being able to do it when it really mattered. And I think when we look at examples like that, I think that's where this idea of 10x really starts to break down, because it's not about who does the most, it's who creates the most meaningful outcomes. And for anyone who's listening who maybe hasn't heard, outputs and outcomes before, outputs are tangible. It'd be code shipped, meetings held, or tickets closed, like something we can just keep count of and know whether it happened or not. But outcomes are much more about the effect. So did the thing we did actually matter or have the impact we were hoping for, or did it not? So I know this was the outcomes and outputs idea was something you really wanted to dig into. So I'll pass it back to you, Andy. What do you think about the difference between outputs and outcomes, and how can we think about that when we evaluate performance?
Yeah, and I think the simplest way to think about this, is a sales culture, right? One of the things that's beautiful about sales is that the goals are really clear and concrete, and the outcomes are the only thing that matters, and the outputs are just a means to achieving it, right? So if you were to walk in to your, end of quarter meeting and tell your boss, well, I made X amount of outbound calls and took Y amount of meetings and qualified Z amount of deals, they would ask you one question only: did you hit your quota? And if the answer is no, you probably need to go and find a new job, right? Over, if the answer is no enough times in a row, you're definitely going to need to go and find a new job. And I use sales as an example here just because it's very easy to distill the difference, right? The outcome that you're looking for is closed deals. It's top line revenue. The outputs are just the means to achieve top line revenue. In different organizations, that's widely variable, right? So I lead part of a professional services organization, and when I think about outcomes for the team that I lead, it changes from just maintaining overall good project hygiene, and like NPS scores and customer satisfaction, to deal expansion, to revenue retention, to me as a leader who's got a whole bunch on my plate. One of the things I really value is not needing to worry too much about you, right? Knowing simply that when I ask for something to be done, it will be done, and I will be told when it's done. And I think when we think about performance, when we think about especially like team building and team cohesion, we also need to think about the balance of that as a leader, right? So oftentimes you might accept somebody who has a lower ceiling on the outputs or outcomes perspective if they check all the other boxes, that they're a solid performer and they're somebody that you don't need to worry about. And you might also take somebody who has a super high ceiling as far as what they deliver, but also needs a lot of hand holding, right? And you have to kind of balance and architect your team depending on what you are good at, what you can teach, what you can enable, what business outcomes you're tasked with achieving, and also kind of who you inherit from a headcount point of view, and what their skills are, right? So I think as a leader, it comes down to, again, I keep on coming back to this: setting the grounds, right? Setting the conditions for performance, and then understanding what those performance goals are and how you build your team to achieve those performance goals. We had talked about this, I think, on a prior conversation where I had a manager who, we found out after the fact, all of the team that she had hired, we all had the same disc profile. So she had a natural bias to hire people who thought like her, which is really good for like strategy and ideation. But the problem was that no one on our team was good at actually following through on those sorts of things, right? So thinking about team cohesion and the diversity of your team to make sure that you've got the right balance of follow through and strategy and big ideas and big thinking, so that your team can be cohesive. And that, I think, is really where you get into that 10x piece, like genuinely, because I don't think it's a matter of Ed is a 10x performer. I think the best way for Ed to be 10x is Ed's teams are 10x as successful as other teams. Like Ed's group gets stuff done, right? And it's a matter of working through people, not working to people.
Yeah, and there's one more layer I wanted to add to this idea of outputs versus outcomes, which is just the idea of value also.
Mm,
Because you could be getting outcomes, but not all outcomes are valuable or providing the value that you were hoping for, right? You could ship a feature that technically works, but it doesn't solve the right problem. Or you could launch something that doesn't move any metrics, or deliver an output that creates more confusion, or problems or something like that. So I would say, value we then could do as an extension off of the outcome, where we say, did this outcome actually make things better in the way we wanted or the way we hoped? Did it help a user? Did it make an extra sale? Did it create leverage? Did it move our business forward? That sort of thing. And then that helps it to not just be about how fast you got there or what we got done, but about whether the destination was actually worth it. And we aren't going to talk about pricing or rates here, although that was something that came to mind when we were prepping for this episode, and it might be a future episode we talk about in terms of like value-based pricing. Um, but I think, underlying this, it should be this question of like, are we producing things that are just done, or things that are generally valuable? Are we getting value out of them? And what do we consider valuable? And that can shift. That can shift a lot. And also, I guess, as a little segue for you again, what we consider valuable does shift depending on where someone is in their career. And you made a point as we were prepping for this episode about how things can shift based on if someone's more junior or more senior as far as outputs and outcomes. Do you want to unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, and there's so I'll kind of do it at a high level, and then there's a second part I'll follow through with. So, if we look at like most people's career trajectories, let's assume like college educated, super duper traditional, like average sort of life and lifestyle. There's kind of you're going to spend the first 5 to 10 years of your career building your skills, right? Learning to do what you do, right? If you're interested in leadership roles, trying to get yourself into it. And then so that's a lot of output oriented things, right? You've got to do a whole lot of stuff, right? You kind of might start as the person getting the coffee, right? And then doing all the work nobody wants to do, and then moving into kind of more interesting, more thought oriented work. And then as you move further on in your career, it's really about delegation and outcomes that you can drive through people. And Arthur Brooks talks about this. He talks about it as the two different types of intelligence. This is in Strength to Strength. He talks about it. It's fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. And basically, when you're young, up until about 40 or so, you have your peak amount of fluid intelligence, right? It's your ability to learn new things, right? Do really, really hard work, right? If you're a lawyer, these are going to be the best times for you to be an active litigant, right? You're going to be the best litigant in your firm, right? If you're a researcher, you're probably going to do your most brilliant research, right? If you're a coder, you're probably going to write the most of it, and it's going to be the most technically proficient. As you move later in your career, you get more crystallized intelligence. So you might be less sharp, generally speaking, right? If you're thinking like in mathematics, you might not be able to solve the most complex mathematical equations that you had earlier. And Arthur Brooks frequently talks about not being able to read the essays that he wrote in his 30s now that he's a man of 60 or so, because he just can't understand it anymore. But you have a breadth of experience and a breadth of knowledge from your career, from your life. So your ability to tie disparate ideas together or make connections across things becomes much, much more apparent in the back half of your career. And I think you see this quite frequently. It's why usually CEOs are older, right? Generally speaking, right? You kind of have to promote through those ranks, and there's a different type of intelligence, a different type of skill set that you're working on in order to drive that. And I think it's worth acknowledging, right, that like you're probably going to be doing a lot of output oriented things when you're younger, right? That's how you build the skill set. Those oftentimes can be the hard things, but you can be disconnected from the actual outcomes. And then as you get more, senior in your career, you're really focused on synthesizing everything that's going on and really focusing on running the business and delivering the outcomes for the business. How do you deliver growth? How do you build products that are lovable? How do you streamline the business so it's working most efficiently for what you're doing?
Yeah, when you used a sales example earlier, and I think that's another good analogy we can use, where somebody who's junior, who's just came in into a new sales job or is just getting their feet under them and understanding how this works. It's for them, it's probably about how many cold calls are they making in a day. Like it's literally the
Yeah.
output of how many calls are they making. It's not necessarily about the batting average at that point or how successful they are. It's like you just got to get the reps in and make the phone calls. And then at a
Building the
certain
skill set.
point, yep, yeah, and at a certain point, I mean, I've seen them. I'm sure you have as well, where you've got the more senior salespeople who they just make a couple of calls or maintain a relationship, and they're able to get great sales results and great outcomes without as much output. And so I think that's definitely one of the shifts that I see. And we had talked about somebody who
And
prepares 10 times as much. Well, maybe at the beginning you have to prepare 10 times as much, but as you get more reps and more skill, maybe eventually it only takes you an hour to prepare for an hour meeting instead of 10 hours to prepare for an hour meeting.
yeah, and I think right, what I'm hearing too here, Ed, is about the foundation, right? Because I think you can oftentimes look at that enterprise sales rep, like let's stay on the sales analogy, who closes one or two deals a year, but they're multi-million deals, and be like, well, that guy's job is so easy. And it might be kind of on paper because they're dealing with one company, right? So Ed only sells to, Acme Co. But the reason Ed is capable of selling to Acme Co. is because Ed's made 100,000 cold calls in his life, right? You've done all of those outputs, you've taken all those lumps, you've learned all those things to have the foundation to now really know when you call up Acme Co. what it is that they care about, and to actually have the patience and the know-how to drive a 6, 12, 18, 24 month sales cycle instead of, when you're starting out, you're doing 500 cold calls a day, and if you close a deal, it only takes you 5 minutes to close that deal. But also, that deal is, worth peanuts compared to what that 24-month cycle, Acme Co. looks like.
Yeah. So I guess the question we should lead to next is if we're not chasing 10x, what are we really aiming for? Because some people will say it's easy to criticize the 10x myth, but it might be hard for some people to reframe what real lasting impact actually looks like. So for me, and we've kind of talked about this some, but for me, that shift starts by focusing less on the individual heroics and what individuals are doing, and letting go of this lone genius idea or concept, and instead looking at what someone brings to a team. Earlier, I mentioned that question I like to ask in interviews: what do you bring to a team that no one else does? And I ask that question not because I'm looking for some rare tool or framework or coding trick or something that they know that nobody else knows. I'm asking because I want to understand what their special sauce is. Like, what's the thing that makes them the missing ingredient for the team? Or how do they, to kind of quote the Big Lebowski, like, how do they tie the team together by just being there? And I think that really shifts the idea of 10x from speed and volume to impact and influence. So it becomes less about how fast can you go or how much can you do, and a lot more about what kind of difference do you make and what kind of impact do you unlock for the people around you. And I think if we let go of the idea that 10x is about one person doing superhuman work, and instead we ask how someone contributes to the success of the team, we get to something that's much more meaningful. And this gets us almost touching into some territory for our next episode, where we're going to explore the idea of the glue guy or the glue gal, the teammate who isn't always in the spotlight, but who holds the whole thing together, who's making assists, who notice what's missing and connecting the dots or helping others show up at their best. Um, but I think, we'll touch on it here briefly because I do really believe that true 10x impact is not about heroics at all. It's about enabling others to succeed. So it's not the person who talks the most in the meetings, like we saw in your example from LinkedIn earlier, or who ships the most code. It's who can help other people get unstuck, who builds trust, who fills gaps before they become problems. So I know you've worked with some high performing teams. Without getting too much into our topic for our next episode, have you ever seen someone whose presence elevated everyone around them, not just because they were loud or flashy, but because of how they contributed to the team's success? And does anything stand out to you about the impact that those folks have?
Yeah, I think when I'm looking at that sort of individual, one of the key attributes usually seems to be a degree of humility, um, within that, right? And you see these on teams everywhere, and like, this isn't an archetype that you can easily recreate because they exist differently in every team in every organization. So it could be the person who's just always in a good mood and lightens up the team, like just takes some of the weight out of the room, right? We worked with a person who just gladly took on all of the kind of unsexy work, asked thoughtful questions, right? Never complained about anything, and just was like solid 100% of the time, right? Good day, bad day. it was the same output from that individual, right? And in sports, I think about this a lot. You see, we always index for like the guy who scores the most points or assists or whatever, right? The things that actually show up on the score sheet. But if you look at a lot of like really great sports analysis, you realize that the play away from the ball, the play away from the puck is oftentimes the thing that sets it up. And sometimes that's the all-star, right? Sometimes that's the person who's on the Wheaties box. Sometimes it's not the person on the Wheaties box, right? But the selflessness of that, of understanding like, hey, we're trying to achieve these outcomes, and I'm going to play my role to achieve these outcomes, whether that's literally your job description or just you've read the room and you're like, hey, you know what? This room could really use a dumb joke right now, or they just need somebody to volunteer to do this thing, or the trash needs to be taken out, or whatever it is. It's all part of the work, as we talked about before, and all these things just go such a long way to creating the conditions for the team to be successful.
Yeah, yeah, and we'll get into it a lot more next episode on those specific people, but they're making the kind of contribution that doesn't show up on a dashboard or maybe even in a performance review, but it has a positive impact on almost everything else.
And it's almost, you don't sometimes with those individuals, or like these behaviors, you don't notice it until it's gone
Yeah.
too, right? Like that's one of the key indicators. Like all of a sudden, this thing that we were taking for granted, we forgot that we were even taking it for granted.
Yeah, and I think that's because when we focus only on individual output, we're going to miss out on how much real performance comes from the way other people enable each other to exceed. So we already talked earlier about how outputs don't always equal outcomes, but even outcomes don't tell the whole story unless we're looking at how they scale across a team or how they actually make things better. So for me, the goal isn't to hire or become some mythical 10x individual. It's to build 10x environments, teams that are better together than any one person could ever be alone. There's that saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think it's around that kind of concept in a lot of ways. And I think we can do this without completely reinventing or ourselves or how we approach things. We just have to make a few mindset shifts. So the couple that come to mind for me is, as we've already talked about, first focus on outcomes, not just outputs. So instead of asking how much did we ship, start asking did we solve the right problem? And then second, I think if we start building systems that multiply impact by removing friction, clarifying priorities, or creating psychological safety so people can do their best work, then we can start to see some of this team, kind of team 10x instead of individual 10x. And the research I could find does back this up. I saw some that said fixing task misalignment alone can recover 35% of lost productivity. And then there's research that teams with strong psychological safety have been shown to boost innovation by over 60%. And that includes reducing error rates and improving retention. So I would say these aren't myths where the 10x I think is. These are real measurable effects of better environments. The best teams aren't made of unicorns or I don't know. I've thought of this idea a lot. Like if you have a team that's a rock star and a ninja, it's not going to be a very successful team. You're going to have one who's trying to play the guitar while the other one's trying to like sneak in and assassinate someone or whatever. And they're not really going to
But I
work
bet they
together.
both could do really, really excellent high kicks.
That's probably true, but I don't know if the music they make together will be very good. So yeah, I mean, I think the best teams are built on trust, clarity, and support. So, Andy, when you think about how we reframe performance, especially if we want to move away from chasing 10x individuals and focus on building high performing teams, are there any shifts that you can think of that you think actually matter, or where do you think leaders or teams should start in making these shifts?
I think you nailed it earlier, right? You mentioned building the team, or solving the right problem, and I think when I think about this, and I think about hiring, or developing, it's a matter of understanding what problem you're really trying to solve, right? And sometimes you do need that proverbial 10x engineer or sales rep, or whatever, and it's worth the cost, right? Both financially, or sometimes the personality cost, associated with it. But don't try to cut butter with a chainsaw, right? Make sure that what you're hiring for and the problem that you're trying to solve is appropriate for what you're trying to bring in. Sometimes you need, an intern. Sometimes you need somebody who can rebuild your whole system. Sometimes you need a disruptor. Sometimes you need somebody who's gonna, come in and be like the twin brother from Beer Fest, and you're not even gonna know that he's a new person, right? Like you just need somebody who can slide in and assimilate quickly. And I think it's about being thoughtful about that and making sure that we're solving the right problem and looking at the whole thing, right? Because you're trying to have the sum be or the outcome be greater than the sum of its parts,
Hmm.
right? That's really what you're trying to solve. And if you're just looking for elite performers, you're not going to be able to accomplish that because it just like the dream team is a myth, generally speaking. The true championship team is made up of a combination of elite players and role players, and you just need to understand what you have already on staff, what you can emphasize, and what gaps you're trying to fill.
Yeah, and I think I said it before, but I do think a truly great team can accomplish 10 times more than any one person ever could alone, even if they're a 10x person or maybe even a 100x person. I think the team is still going to have better outcomes in the long term. Um, but it doesn't come from one person just doing that hero work. It comes from a group of people who are focused on making things better together and having consistent shared improvement. So I think one approach or mindset shift that we could also include here is this the idea of a 1.1x mindset. So instead of chasing the 10x performers, what if we focused on being 10% better or even 1% better if we want to go even smaller than that? But for the sake of the 10 numbers, we'll use the 10x here. And so what if as an individual, I try to be 10% better? What if as a team we try to be 10% better? What if as an organization we try to be 10% better? And we just make small, consistent improvements over time. Those are going to compound just like compound interest. If we had a 1.1x or 10% improvement repeated consistently, we're ultimately going to outperform any short term bursts of performance. And we probably will do it without burning people out, without having ego clashes, or without having any kind of chaos or loss of knowledge or one person who only knows how to do the stuff. In this context, I would say like a 1.1x developer, they might take the time to write some better documentation or make some changes to onboarding process to make it smoother for the next person, or maybe take some time out to mentor someone else or do something that makes the next person's job just a little bit easier or reduces a little bit of the toil so they don't have to do the same busy work all of the time. And when we multiply that to a team, that would mean a 1.1x team. They're a team that shares knowledge, that lifts each other up, that solves problems faster because they work better together than they would be able to work alone. And I think for a lot of people, this idea doesn't sound flashy, and that's probably because it's kind of not. It's just this thing that we have to do. Where if we have this mindset of 1.1x, it'll really add up over time, and ultimately, I think that is what compounds into 10x performance because we've now created a 10x team. So, what do you think, Andy? If a leader wants to move away from the 10x myth and build a stronger, more sustainable team, what's at least one mindset or habit you'd tell them that you think they should focus on first?
Yeah, and I think I've been kind of harping on this through most of our conversation today, Ed. And I think it comes down to roster construction, right? I think it's a matter of, look, most people who are listening to this, most people we know are not building teams from scratch, right? They're inheriting a team or they have a current team that they're maybe overhauling, or maybe they're adding some staff to that team, right? Backfilling attrition or growth, right? But they're probably not building from the ground up. I think it comes down to understand what you have, understand the weaknesses and the strengths of what you have, and try to shore up your weaknesses, emphasize your strengths, and also know what you as a leader are good at, right? If you're good at talent development, and if you have a track record of successfully doing things, doing, growing junior employees and into senior employees or making them super successful, emphasize that skill set that you have individually, right? If you have other skill sets, try to hire for folks who fit within that archetype that you work with the best, or that you have the biggest track record, delivering results through. If you're a new leader, look for people you can trust, right? And you can lean on and you can delegate as you build those skills and as you build your team. Um, so I don't know. I think it just all comes down to be thoughtful and make sure that you're trying to solve the right problem.
Yeah. And one, as you were mentioning the how do you structure your team and what skills do you need on there, it reminded me of a tool that I like. And I know there's other tools like this out there, but this one is from Management 3.0, and it's the Team Competency Matrix. And
Mm,
it's you basically go through, and it's an exercise where you say, like, what are the skills that we need to be successful on this team? And it could be technical skills, but it could be more, like, yeah, you might need somebody who knows Kubernetes, but you also might need somebody who can communicate with stakeholders, or things like that. And so you kind of say, well, do we need, like, how many people do we need with this skill set, and do we need them to all be experts, or can they just be okay at it? And then you kind of do an evaluation of your team, and you say, oh, we need Kubernetes skills. We have to have an expert, and then we need at least one other person who's okay at it. And then you could evaluate, do we have that skill set on the team? And you could do that for any skill set. And then, that might be something that would help with building teams in a way that you're not getting all one type of person or all one type of skill set, and that you're able to balance those things out. So there's just one little idea out there, that some folks might be able to use.
makes a ton of sense.
Cool. I think that's where we're going to wrap up for today. We started with a big idea, the idea of the mythical 10x contributor. And along the way, we broke it down from a few angles. We looked at where the idea came from, why it's so appealing, and how it can quietly create more harm than good when it becomes a cultural expectation instead of a useful metaphor. We explored the difference between outputs and outcomes, and how real value isn't about how much you do, but about the impact you create. We talked about the pressure and the pitfalls of chasing individual greatness, and what it looks like instead to build environments that multiply collective performance. And we landed on something we both really believe in. The best teams aren't built on unicorns, they're built on shared momentum, people who make each other better, systems that scale impact instead of heroics. So here's your challenge for the week. Take a look at how your team defines success. Are you measuring speed, volume, or visibility? Or are you creating space to reward clarity, connection, and outcomes? And if you're someone in a leadership role, ask yourself, am I trying to find a 10x person, or am I building a 10x team? Thanks for exploring leadership with us today on Leadership Explored. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. How do you think about the 10x myth? Have you ever worked in a culture that prioritized individual brilliance over team success, or seen someone quietly drive massive impact without needing the spotlight? You can email us at leadershipexplored@gmail.com or connect with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear your stories or ideas for topics you'd like to hear about in the future. If you found this conversation helpful, make sure to follow the show, leave a review, or share it with someone who cares about growing great teams. We'll be back in 2 weeks with our next episode, where we're helping you recognize the glue guy, gal, or non-binary pal on your team. The ones who provide assists, the people making the pass instead of taking the shot, the teammates whose impact is easy to overlook, but essential to everything working. Until then, keep leading with purpose.